After completing his PhD, Professor Brent served as assistant and associate professor of cognitive science at the Johns Hopkins University, where his research focused on computational modeling of how children learn language. He brought these interests to Washington University in St. Louis in 1999, where he developed a second research program in computational biology and eventually phased out computational linguistics. Since 2001, he has focused on computational and molecular methods for improving the accuracy of genome annotation. The Brent Lab is focused on modeling the way in which the functional states of cells are determined by the control systems encoded in genomes. Professor Brent and his students construct quantitative models of biological control networks that will enable them to understand their functions and the conditions to which they are adapted. Please welcome Dr. Brent. All right, boys and girls, Sarah's dad is here and he brought popcorn. All right, so the point of that skit is that you can have the same truth. The guy was introducing the same man, but you notice the first time he introduced the man, he was speaking to a group of little kids and he didn't use appropriate language. His message, while it was true, was really off base. In the second skit, he introduces the same man, but he does so in a way that's appropriate to his audience. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do the same thing. They speak to different audiences. They have different points that they're trying to make. And so their gospels are similar but different. And the reason that they're different is because they're writing to different audiences. And so the fact that there are some differences in the gospels, I have heard people in modernity, people in our time say, you know what, these stories kind of contradict each other, or they don't seem to tell the exact same story, and so they cannot be true. As a Catholic man, I think that that's a fairly preposterous attack because the stories don't contradict each other, they complement each other. I mean, think back to the story or to the skit of the man introducing the girl's father, right? Both introductions were true, but they didn't seem much alike at all because of the appropriateness of the audience. We're going to talk a little bit about the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We're going to do so in a very cursory way, sort of an easy way, just kind of a light introduction to the Gospels. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about Matthew, and because he's the first Gospel. And there's some dispute, some discussion as to whether he was the first Gospel written. From antiquity, the church thought it was so. It's certainly held in high prominence. There are some scholars who think perhaps Mark was written first, that maybe Matthew had, in fact, access to Mark's Gospel. I think those questions are a little bit beyond what we are trying to do here. I think it's important to note that Matthew is written to mainly Jewish Christians, so people who were Jews, who accepted Jesus as the Christ. And his Gospel is probably written, depending on which scholars you read, between the years of 58 to 65, if you think he was the first Gospel written, or between about the year 75 or so if he was written after Mark. But in either case, between, say, 60 and 75 AD. He was perhaps Matthew the disciple. A lot of people question whether it was actually Matthew the disciple or perhaps a disciple of Matthew, somebody who came to the faith through Matthew. And of course, if I learned all about Jesus from Matthew the apostle and I wrote down the things he told me, it would not be inappropriate to say that this is the gospel according to Matthew, even though he's not the one putting pen to paper. Mark's gospel is the shortest gospel. It's written probably somewhere very close to the year 70, perhaps just before or just after the destruction of the temple. And Mark is clearly writing to Gentile Christians. So he has a tendency to explain Jewish things because these are people who were not Jews, who converted to Christianity, who accepted Jesus as the Lord and Savior, but they were not Jews before. It is questioned whether perhaps Mark was a disciple or a friend of Peter, and certainly he was acquainted with Barnabas, who was a disciple of St. Paul. Now, I talked about Matthew and Mark, one writing to a Jewish audience and another to a non-Jewish audience. And I'd like to read a little blurb from each, recounting the same event, and you can kind of get a sense of why scholars think that Matthew was written to Jews and Mark was written to non-Jewish Christians. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at Matthew 15, and the story that we're particularly looking at is the story of the tradition of the elders. So chapter 15, verse 1. Then Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They do not wash their hands when they eat." He says to them in reply, "Why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition?" So Jesus gives an answer. There's no explanation of this tradition of washing hands before they eat. Now let's compare that to Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 4. Now, when the Pharisees with some scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they observed that some of his disciples ate their meals with unclean, that is, unwashed hands. For the Pharisees, and in fact all Jews, do not eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the tradition of the elders. And on coming from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things that they have traditionally observed, the purification of cups and jugs and kettles and beds. So the Pharisees and the scribes, so do you notice how in Mark's gospel, he explains this tradition of washing the hands, whereas in Matthew's gospel, he doesn't feel the need to explain. So that's an example, if you read the gospels attentively, how scholars came to the conclusion that Matthew is probably writing to Jews who converted to Christianity because they know the tradition. He doesn't need to explain it, whereas Mark is feeling the need to explain it because he's writing to a group that's not familiar. Luke is written to people who are not Palestinian. Luke himself was probably not Palestinian. He seems to have a lack of understanding of the geography of the Holy Land. He was probably written in the late 70s, so again, within that first century. And scholars speculate that he is the physician mentioned by St. Paul in Colossians chapter 4, verse 14. And we also find Paul mentioning him in Philemon, verse 24, and in 2 Timothy 4:11, his name is mentioned as a companion of Paul. Luke seems to have an awful lot of knowledge of the nativity of Christ, so there's speculation as to whether he knew Mary or someone who was very close to Mary. And the final gospel we'll spend an entire lesson on in a few weeks is the Gospel of John. Tradition holds that John, the beloved disciple, is the author of this particular gospel, and it's the latest written. It's written around the year 95. And so this is a gospel that's written after several decades. And John tends to be much more theological. He tends to tell the story not so much in chronological fashion, but rather as a story of the Messiah. So his is kind of less chronological and more symbolic. Thanks for listening, and God bless. All right, so one of the things that happens a lot in the Gospels is Jesus works miracles. And I find that there's a great tendency among people today to automatically dismiss the miracles. And there is even within some Catholic intellectuals this tendency to dismiss the miracles of Jesus and say that really these are things that the gospel writers made up. And I want you to know that that's really not consistent with what the church teaches. The church is pretty clear. If you read the Second Vatican Council most recently in a document called De Verbum, mentions that we take the Gospels to be historical in nature and that they really pass on what Jesus said and did when he walked the earth. Now, at first blush, it seems to make a lot of sense to deny the miracles, to say, look, these are people who were living in backwoods Palestine 2,000 years ago, and clearly what happened is one of two things. Either they were deceived by Jesus, or they made up the stories knowing that Jesus hadn't done them. So let's take a look at those two possibilities. Either Jesus did something or he did nothing. All right, so if he did nothing, the story would go that the followers of Jesus, trying desperately to prove that Jesus was in fact divine, made up all these stories and inserted them into the Gospels to give kind of their Messiah a little oomph, a little get over the hump so people will accept him. I have a problem with that theory, and the problem is this. On what basis did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John believe Jesus was God? I mean, if Jesus wasn't doing those miracles, if they felt the need to embellish Jesus' life, then he wasn't much of a Messiah. So it seems to me a little bit inconsistent. Second, we spent a lot of time establishing the fact that Jesus' eyewitness accounts of his life were written within the first generation of the church. In other words, there were a lot of followers, there were a lot of people who chose not to follow Jesus who were around when these stories were being written. There is no account of people dismissing these miracles of Jesus as if they didn't happen. In other words, we don't find accounts from Roman historians, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger. We don't find any Roman historians or Jewish historians for that matter who say Jesus was just this average preacher, carpenter guy, and all these stories were made up about him. Rather, what we find is there's an acknowledgement that something was happening, but they often attribute that something to the work of the devil or to deception and hysteria. So let's start with the premise that the disciples were recounting what they thought really happened, because I think that pretty clearly is the case. Now, at first blush, it's pretty easy to think, well, gosh, maybe Jesus was just a great trickster. I mean, you know, Chris Angel, mind freak. And he really deceived all these guys into thinking that these were in fact miracles, when in fact he just had some secret cures that he knew about, or he was able to use sleight of hand. Again, on the surface, that argument seems to make sense, but if you delve into the story itself and really evaluate that claim based on the truth of the text, it's a little bit harder to defend. So for example, go through the Gospels and find any miracle or two or three and ask yourself, how could Jesus have deceived people around him about this miracle? So, you know, you want to take the feeding of the 5,000 with the loaves and fish. Gospels tell us that Jesus was out in the middle of nowhere and they didn't have any food, and there was a huge crowd, thousands of people, around 5,000, and they typically only counted men, so it was probably even more than 5,000 people present at the event. He asked the disciples, well, let's give them some food ourselves. And the disciples are looking around saying, we wouldn't have enough money. It would take a year's worth of wages. It would take $40,000 in our economy to feed all these people. And Jesus says, well, what do we have? Some loaves and some fishes. Jesus pronounces a blessing. They distribute the food, and there's enough left to fill 12 baskets. Now, there's a lot of symbolic language in there. But where could Jesus possibly have been hiding enough food that his followers wouldn't have known was there? It would have taken a caravan of people to haul the food. The notion that that miracle was a deception is almost unfathomable. Take the man who was blind from birth, who was begging in the temple, that Jesus heals. How is it possible that Jesus was able to pull off that hoax? I mean, did he really some 10, 20, 30, 40 years earlier plant this guy and get him to pretend he was blind for his whole life so that sometime in the future he could come and pretend to heal him? My point is that if you take any of these miracles and ask yourself, okay, is it really possible for Jesus to have been deceiving the people around him? I think the answer is a resounding no, even if he had the apostles, that group closest to him, collaborating with him in the deceit. I just don't think it's possible. So it's kind of fun to go through and choose a couple of miracles and look and see how ridiculous it would be that people were being tricked by this particular event. Thanks for listening. God bless. All right, so we've taken a look at miracles and the fact that it's really difficult to imagine them being a hoax. I want to touch briefly on the notion of the greatest miracle of all, and that's the resurrection. Because it seems to me, and St. Paul in fact says, that all of Christianity hinges on the claim of the resurrection. If Christ did not rise from the dead, our faith is a mockery. And if he did rise from the dead, then he is who he said he was, and he is the Messiah. So let's take a look at the event of the resurrection and try to do so without just relying on the Gospels. Let's look at it from sort of a police detective sort of way. We're trying to figure out what happened that weekend. So let's start with some of the facts. Jesus was a hotly contested commodity. The Pharisees were deadly afraid of him because so many people were following him. The Romans, who just wanted peace, they're not peaceful people, don't get me wrong, but they just wanted this conquered land to be tranquil so they could govern them and get taxes from them rather easily. They didn't really care about the internal religious debates. This Jesus claims that he's going to be resurrected from the dead. And so there's a lot of fear and a lot of angst as to what's going to happen after they get rid of him. So they know they've got to kill him, the Pharisees. They've got to get rid of this guy. And they need the Romans to do it so the blood's not on their hands. And they need it to be because Jesus was blaspheming. So they set up this whole elaborate scheme. They catch Jesus in a religious blasphemy, and they say that that blasphemy has to do with the kingship and the right of Caesar to rule. So they drag the Romans into the event. The Romans crucify him, and that's how we approach the weekend. So the question becomes, did he rise from the dead? Well, it seems to me that there are several possibilities. The first possibility, frankly, if you came to me and said a friend of yours rose from the dead, the first thing I would do would be what? The first thing I would do is I would go check to see that there was in fact an empty tomb. So how do we know that the tomb of Jesus was in fact empty? How do we know that the disciples didn't make the whole thing up and Jesus' body was still in the tomb? Well, I think the way that we know is that the Romans and the Jews, when Christians were starting to spread this story, the followers of Jesus were starting to spread this story that Jesus had resurrected from the dead, they would have gone and checked the tomb, looking for evidence of the crime or whatever. When they went to the tomb, we know that they found the tomb empty because they tell us so. Their explanation for the empty tomb is that the disciples stole the body. But had they found the body in the tomb, they would have been able to squish and squelch Christianity before it got started, because it's built on the claim of the resurrection. So Peter's running around, for example, on Pentecost saying, this Jesus that they killed rose from the dead. All the Pharisees or the Romans would have had to do would have been to take that crowd to the tomb, show the body of Jesus, and none of them would have followed the way, right? So we know that they checked the tomb, and we know that they found it empty. So, honestly, when I find the empty tomb, my very first suspicion is that his followers stole the body and made the story up to gain fame, fortune, whatever. How do we know that that's not the case? Well, I think the way that we know that it's not the case is that you could make the argument that they in fact anticipated being famous because they were inside men of Jesus. But the historic reality is that they were all persecuted. And in the end, and this is the money ball right here, in the end, they all died for their faith in Jesus. Look, I don't know about you. I'm not sure that I'm brave enough to die for what I know is true. I'm sure not going to die for something I know is a lie. In other words, if me, John, James, and the others, if we stole the body, I'm not going to die for him. I'm not going to die proclaiming the messiahship of Jesus. I'm going to absolutely deny the story and live peaceably. And so the fact is, all of the apostles, except for one, died horrible martyrs' deaths. So we know that they really believed that he rose from the dead. So we know that they didn't steal the body. So what we have so far is we know the tomb was empty. We know the disciples didn't do it. That basically proves the resurrection. Let me just tell you, I'm going to go through a couple of other scenarios, but where we are now basically proves the resurrection. We've proven, without really using scripture, just using history, we've proven that the tomb was empty, and we've proven that his followers did not steal the body. That almost proves the resurrection. But let's look at a couple of other theories that I've heard and that are part of our history. Well, perhaps Jesus survived the crucifixion and then appeared to the apostles, and they mistaked it, whatever the word would be. They mistook it for a resurrection. All right, I think that's pretty ludicrous. I can tell the difference between a resurrected human being and glorious body versus somebody who looks like death warmed over because they survived a crucifixion 2 days ago. Remember, Jesus has the crucifixion on Friday, and on Sunday he's appearing to people with no medical care. That's pretty hard to believe. If you read the accounts, because now we can kind of lean on the Gospels a little bit, since we know the apostles believe the story that they're telling. Their account was that Jesus was brutally crucified, and Roman records would tell us that too, that crucifixion was brutal, and that he in fact had a lance in his side, and blood and water flowed, which means a lung was punctured and probably the cardiac sac was punctured. For Jesus to then appear on Sunday and convince the apostles, because remember, they really believed he was resurrected, to convince them that he was a resurrected person, that seems rather ludicrous to me. Other possibility I've heard is that they lost the tomb, that the Romans and the Jews were just kind of confused as to where the tomb was. Yeah. You know, the fact that they lived 2,000 years ago and didn't have electricity doesn't mean they were also stupid. They knew that this was a political hot potato, and they knew that there was a real danger after he died that somebody would steal the body and claim a resurrection. They certainly were smart enough to guard the correct tomb. Finally, I've heard, well, you know, the Gospels do recount that there was this earthquake. And so perhaps what happened is they put Jesus in the tomb, and this earthquake caused a great fissure, and Jesus' body fell into the crack. Interesting. Stupid, but interesting. You're telling me that the Romans and the Jews, who had a great deal to lose had Jesus been resurrected or had the story of his resurrection been circulating, they got to the tomb and they found this big crack, and they didn't dig down to find his body? And they didn't tell people, look, we never found his body, but we know it's in there? I would expect to find all these Roman historians and Jewish historians commenting on the fact that Christianity is built on the most dubious of lies, because we know that the body was there and there was this terrible earthquake and blah, blah, blah. We don't find any of that in any Roman or Jewish histories whatsoever. And in fact, when we read the Gospels, which we now believe to be credible because they all died for their stories, they don't tell the story that they found the tomb in that sort of a case. I mean, and think about that. Do you think Peter, James, and John were that stupid that they got to the tomb and found this big crack and the body missing and said, oh, I guess he rose from the dead? I mean, that's pretty stupid. You are smarter than that. I'm smarter than that. Surely these guys were smarter than that too, than to get to the tomb, find a terrible crack, and immediately jump to the conclusion that he was resurrected. So we have an empty tomb. The apostles didn't steal the body. No earthquake swallowed it. They were guarding the right tomb. There just really isn't a very reasonable explanation for the events of that weekend, other than that perhaps Jesus is who he said he was, and he did precisely what he said he would do. God bless.